Hello, everyone. My name is Bronwyn Heerspink, and I'm the president of UR POLIS. And I'm going to start us off today on another series that we did in a previous year that focuses on teaching students about the main sort of assignments and study habits that they should have going into a degree offered by PIUS. So today I'm going to start us off with a little presentation on how to write a briefing note. So this is something that you'll find in quite a few PIUS classes. They're technical documents typically used in a government setting. The purpose of them is to typically explain an issue or a policy, but both comprehensively and concisely. So the way I sort of usually approach it is to imagine that you're working in a ministry and your minister has a press conference on a topic that she isn't overly familiar with, and it's coming up in 5 minutes. So after reading your briefing note, she should be prepared to answer questions on the topic. So it should give her a really strong overview of a topic, but in a really, really short period of time. So some briefing notes may also require you to provide a recommended course of action. So in that case, you're presenting the background on a topic, and you are going to be providing a recommendation on how to address that topic. And that's the briefing note we're going to be looking at through this presentation. So you can expect to see these assignments in poli-sci and econ classes, and I hope that this will give you a good structure to go into your classes when you're given a briefing note assignment. So when we're writing a briefing note on a policy issue, there's a traditional structure that you will encounter. So that's the title, the issue, the background, the analysis, and the conclusion or the recommendation. So sometimes you may encounter a different type of briefing note. For example, a briefing note that just provides or asks you to provide a summary of a topic. We're not going to focus on that one today, because that's a little bit less common. But we'll be focusing on this sort of policy analysis briefing note. But if you were to encounter that other briefing note, you would do the same thing, but you would cut out the analysis section and the conclusion and recommendation section. So when you're writing a title for a briefing note, they should be both short and descriptive. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to use the example of a briefing note I wrote for my Economics of Crown Corporations class, and it was on ISC, so the Information Services Corporation. So we were supposed to write, we were tasked with writing a briefing note to a cabinet minister about whether or not ISC should be brought back into being a Crown Corporation. So my title was The Privatization of the Information Services Corporation of Saskatchewan. So it tells you what the subject of it is, and it tells you sort of what we're going to be encountering with this, but it's not overly wordy. We want it to be short and quippy, but easily identifiable of what the issue is. So when we're going into the issue of a briefing note, it should tell the reader what the topic of the note is, so the particular issue or policy being discussed, as well as what the conclusion of the note is. So if you just glance at it, it's sort of like your thesis statement in a sense, right? What is it that we're talking about? What's the answer? But we're going to keep it even more short and sweet than a thesis. We're not going to list why. It's just going to be what the topic is and what the recommendation is. So in this case, my example is this briefing note analyzes the government of Saskatchewan's decision to privatize the Information Services Corporation of Saskatchewan, ISC in brackets. So that, again, it's always a good practice if you're going to be using an acronym to put it in brackets when you first identify it, and concludes by recommending that the government continue to allow ISC to operate as a public company. Now we're moving on to the background portion of things. So the background is a lot, and you're maybe saying to yourself, Bronwyn, this is a lot of information to put in a really short document, but this is just a guideline. So when you're approaching a topic, some of this stuff may not be relevant to the topic that you're going through, and some of it, truthfully, it'll overlap. So the big three things that you're wanting to touch on in this is what the policy or issue is, the history of the policy or issue, and the current status of the policy or issue. So here are a couple kind of sub-themes within those kind of three big things that you need to touch on. So when you're talking about what the policy or issue is, maybe consider the following. Defining some term if you feel it's necessary. What the policy or legislation does. Whose jurisdiction does it fall under? Is it federal, provincial, municipal? Is it a specific ministry? And who is impacted by this policy or issue? And then when you're jumping into the history of the policy or issue, it's always good to give an overview of past legislation or policy action or inaction, what brought about the past action or inaction surrounding the policy or issue, and what impacts the policy or issue has caused. Then when you're looking at the current status of the policy or issue, think about what is currently being done to address the issue, what policies are currently in effect or being developed, what are the current outcomes or issues associated with the issue or policy, what's the public opinion surrounding the policy or issue, and why is action needed? So all of these are really big, important things that you need to cover in your background and in a really short period of time. So it's really important to be asking yourself, what can I kind of connect in here? How do I highlight the most important information? So we'll look at some examples here. So when we're looking at, in this example with my ISC briefing note, when I'm talking about what the policy or issue is, I explain it in this short little paragraph here. So ISC was created as a provincial crown in 2000. So when it existed, what it is. It tells you it's the crown, and it tells you when it was started. It was responsible for administering all of these things. It tells you what it does, and a little bit of the history there too, in that it was previously, these services that ISC was providing was previously being provided by several different ministries and crowns. So this was a consolidation that created ISC. And then you're looking at this and you're like, this is a whole lot of information, but this is connected to the history of the policy or issue. So some of this stuff isn't really relevant to what you would typically be doing in another briefing note for a different class, because this was a class that was an economics class and we needed to show some course comprehension. These two paragraphs here, the second and third paragraph, were specifically relevant to the course I was in, but I thought I might as well include it in here because it may be helpful to you. But some of these other things just gives you a pretty strong history of the issue. So that in this first paragraph here, where it's just the one sentence, it tells you some of the future things that ISC became responsible for after it was created. And then why in these two paragraphs here, it's why the government of Saskatchewan created ISC. So what were the economic rationales behind it? And then what tools did the ISC use to provide these services? And then so here is where it gets really kind of into the more modern history of it, talking about privatization, which was the main sort of topic about this briefing note. So I'm outlining here the main points of that legislation. You don't want to give the entire summary of it because sometimes it's not necessary. Sometimes you can just provide the name of the legislation, but if it's something like this where privatization was the main sort of issue, it's best to give a little bit of background on that, what it entailed. So I outlined the main points of the legislation that privatized ISC. The income of ISC, that's always relevant if you're looking at specific companies or if you're looking at a policy, looking at things like cost or looking at things like revenue. What was the revenue from the payout from the privatization, and how many people were working there? Because if you're thinking about something like politics, politics is a people business. So if your job or if your briefing note, your issue can affect somebody's employment, it's important to note that sort of thing. So think about this as both a policymaking tool, but also a piece of politics itself. So sometimes it's relevant to include things like we said earlier, like public opinion. How is this going to affect people? And that's what we're kind of going to talk about a little bit more here in the current status too. So that gives you, I'm in this first paragraph here, I'm giving you what's happening currently under the new master service agreement with the government of Saskatchewan and ISC. So what's happening now? What's their current agreement? What the annual revenue that the government of Saskatchewan receives from ISC is, and then some of the corporate information too. So their corporate income, revenue expenses, where they're operating, employees again, and then here is the policy tools that they use. So again, sort of something specific to this class, but it still might be relevant to you if you're wanting to think about sort of like what are they doing to enact this sort of stuff. And now we're going into what's the fun part of it, the analysis. So the analysis portion of the briefing note should tell its reader what can be done to address the issue, what steps must be taken to implement these options, and what are the pros and cons of each option. So when you're thinking about what can be done to address the issue, you should offer at least 2 suggestions for how to address it. And one of these can be maintaining the status quo. So sometimes, especially when you're dealing with a really big issue, for instance, the ISC privatization is less of a huge issue because it's relatively like the privatization has already taken part. But let's say you're dealing with something like pharmacare, or like something like that, right? Like let's say you're talking about pharmacare. You don't have to have your 2 issues or your 2 options be implement pharmacare fully and don't implement pharmacare. One of your options could be conduct more research on the feasibility of a pharmacare plan in Canada, something like that. It doesn't have to be super like 2 kind of polar opposites, right? You have to sort of think about, well, your options should, even though you want to, your options should both be feasible. Even though you're going to choose one in the end, both of them should be kind of realistic, right? So if you're thinking to yourself, it's not realistic if I have 2 polar opposites, maybe there's something in the middle that you can offer as an option number 2 instead of one that's crazy out there. So yeah, and one of these can be maintaining the status quo. So what steps must be taken to implement these options? Know what needs to be done. So if that is like policy or legislation or investments, are there costs associated with it? These are some of the steps that you need to note to in this section here. And if you're wondering where to find costs, usually you can find some really interesting stuff. If you're dealing with like a big ticket issue, you can look at things like the Parliamentary Budget Office, usually just things like costing things out. But otherwise, you can look at things like annual reports and then do the math yourself. Even though I know a lot of poli-sci students aren't like math brained, it's pretty simple. Don't stress yourself out too much about it. And what are the pros and cons of each option? So in this, I typically would think about things like financial pros and cons, administrative pros and cons, political pros and cons, ethical pros and cons, and environmental pros and cons. You can think of other ones, but these are kind of the big ones that you'll be dealing with most of the issues that you'll be looking at. You don't have to cover one of every single one. Think about the biggest pros and cons of each of the policies. Okay, and then here's an example of my analysis. So we can go and look at, I think let's just take a look at option number 1 here. So if we look at the 2 options, so one of them is bring ISC back under public control, and the other one is the status quo, allow ISC to continue to operate as a private company. So if we're seeing up here, so this part here, my option 1 is what's the option? What is the option? And then my first 2 points here, the approve an expenditure and develop a piece of legislation, those are my implementation steps. And then I have a point on benefits and then little subheaders listing the benefits and then points on disadvantages and little points under the disadvantages. So this is a really clean way of outlining these things here. And when you look at the 2 of them together, it's easy to see, and this will lead into your conclusion. It's easy to see which is the smarter option because we look at there's 1 benefit of option 1 and I have 4 benefits in option 2. I have 2 cons in option 1 and I have 1 con in option 2. So these are kind of little tricks that you can do as you're writing it. Not so, you don't have to be like, oh, well, I prefer option 1, so I'm going to leave out all of these pros of option 2. Don't do that. But if you're wondering at the end, what am I going to recommend? Looking at things like that can be really helpful. This is a nice kind of visual reminder. It's also a good visual reminder if you're thinking about this as a tool that you would say like to give a minister. If the minister maybe isn't completely, if you're thinking like, okay, well, this is a persuasive document at the end of the day. Having more benefits in the one you choose to recommend is a persuasive tool, right? You're being clear, authoritative with your statements. And when they see that there are so many more benefits of one option over the other, that's much better, right? And then your conclusion. So the conclusion should tell the reader what the best course of action is. Again, like I was saying, based upon your analysis. So the best course of action must be one of the 2 options that you outlined in your analysis section. You can't just jump in and say like, oh, actually option 1 and 2 both suck. We should do something else entirely. If you think there's a better option, have that be one of your 2 options, right? You don't want to just, it's like when you're writing an essay and they say, don't introduce any new information in the conclusion. don't do the same thing here. Don't introduce any new policy suggestions in your conclusion. It should be outlined in your analysis. And again, option with the most pros and or the least cons. And then here's my example from my briefing note. It is recommended that the government of Saskatchewan allow ISC to continue to operate as a private company. And so formatting, which is one of the most important and maybe overlooked portions of briefing notes. So your professor may give you a guideline on how to format the briefing note, but the following format is, from what I've had assigned to me, typically the most acceptable and what's kind of common practice. Your titles and subtitles should be in bold. So your main title should be centered at the top of the page, and then the subtitles should be left aligned, but both of them will be bold. So it's really easy to tell what each section is. Again, has to be read quickly. So that formatting is so important. It needs to be really clear. Paragraphs should be short and only contain information about one point. I would say 2 to 4 sentences maximum. The worst thing is if you have a briefing note and it's written like a paper, because it's not easy to contain or to retain that information if it's not structured really clearly, right? You should, if you're able to read it quickly and you're like, okay, point 1, point 2, point 3, it's separated, your brain will retain it better. So think about that. Your writing should be in complete sentences. Just because you're writing concisely doesn't mean that you have to sort of throw all of these grammar conventions away. Write in complete sentences, use correct grammar, don't use contractions. Keep all that, keep all the knowledge that you have about like what proper writing is, but just make it concise. Everything should be single spaced with a blank line between each paragraph, again for legibility, and keeping it single spaced, make sure that it's contained within 2 to 3 pages, which I have there too. So typically most of the ones I've had have been 2 pages. This briefing note that I'm showing you as an example today, it was 3 pages. 4 with citations, but please ask your professor what their expectations are. I would assume most professors would assign a 2-page briefing note. And depending on the class, you may not need to include citations, but be sure to read the syllabus and assignment guidelines carefully. Typically endnotes are a good way to keep your briefing note clean, because then all the citations are at the end, like your little, the endnotes go at the end. So it's a lot cleaner. And again, like I said, briefing notes are not papers. So you have to be really cautious with your formatting, or the formatting outlined by the professor, because nothing's worse than reading a briefing note that's written like a paper. So here's an example of the briefing note that I was using throughout mine. So this is what it looks like. I think it looks really clean. It's easy to tell what each section is. Like I've got my subtitles in bold. It's easy to tell when I'm moving on to a different point. Some of these paragraphs are a little longer. Again, these are some of those ones that were specific to the course where I had to outline like policy tools or economic rationales for government intervention. But if we look at things like my analysis, I think this is the best way of formatting an analysis. Option 1, left aligned. Have your points in big bullet points, and then do smaller dashes when you're going into the benefits and the disadvantages. I think it just looks so much cleaner. And again, easy to tell the difference between, you're like, oh my God, benefits here take up 2 lines, benefits here take up 10 lines, right? It's a visual cue. Yeah, and so that is it for the briefing notes. I hope that this was informative. I hope that you are able to feel a lot more confident going into some of your classes. And be sure to stay tuned to our social media to learn more about how to write papers, how to study, how to write notes, where are some of the best study spots on campus. And be sure to reach out to us if you have any questions. You can also check out the library. It has a lot of great resources on how to write papers, how to approach assignments, things like that. So I would definitely check them out. They have a lot more experience than I do. I've just got a couple years of undergrad under my belt. So be sure to reach out to all the supports that are available to you. And I hope you have a wonderful day. Goodbye.